Hello, everybody. My name is Olivia Wang, and today I'll be talking to you about adolescent trauma and the effect it has on education. The subject of adolescent trauma in terms of education is a developing field. However, the issue of trauma-induced adolescents walking into school campuses across this nation is accelerating like a modern wildfire. Adolescent trauma can be defined as the mental state of a child after experiencing or witnessing abuse. This presentation reviews the effects of childhood trauma on the brain, discusses techniques for identifying symptoms of trauma in adolescents in the classroom setting, and ends with an analysis of different approaches for addressing trauma in the classroom, or creating a trauma-informed classroom atmosphere. The findings of this paper show that the physical demonstrations of adolescent trauma are relatively simple to identify if training on those symptoms were offered to teachers beforehand. While this field is developing, I believe with the right form of advocacy, we will continue to grow and benefit both educators and classrooms for years to come. So, before I get started in this, I really wanted to take a minute and talk to you guys about my experience with adolescent trauma. Um, I it starts with these guys. I'm currently a kindergarten teacher in Stockton, California. If you aren't familiar with the area, we are a relatively small town in Central Valley, California, and we have made many headlines, but just a few would be number one worst city to live by Forbes, yeah, and worst city to raise children, and, and plenty of others. We are known for a high violent crime and unemployment rates. I personally didn't grow up in Stockton. I was raised in a town just outside of Stockton and still commute into work. But when I was in college and I was considering, a career either in social work or in education, the more I learned about how the two kind of intertwined, the more I really thought about the city of Stockton and what those kids really needed. Um, and so when I ended up choosing to move into education, I knew that I wanted to work in this specific demographic, and it has been the best choice I've ever made. This group of kids that you can see here, my little mustaches, they were my first class, um, and they really just changed my life. Um, so it was in this class, my first class on my own, that I met a little boy. He is actually right here. He didn't have the best attendance, so I didn't really have a great picture of him. But for today, we're going to call him Julian. Much like some of his classmates, Julian came to me mid school year, and he was really ill prepared to catch up to his peers. He was very behind academically, and he was just really struggling to kind of come up to speed. So, getting him to a good academic standing point really led to us spending lots of individualized time together, which actually ended up benefiting everybody because very frequently Julian was just kind of forgotten. His relatives or whoever was picking him up would show up 2, 3 hours after school had ended because they had just forgotten he was here. That was my first clue that something was really kind of abnormal. However, the more time we spent together and the more we kind of built a relationship, Julian would share with me frequently that he loved being at school and loved it much more than being at home. But in class, like if you hadn't had I hadn't had those conversations with him and I had just seen his classroom behavior, you would not have guessed that that was the case. When he was around his peers, Julian really experienced some of the most extreme mood swings I'd ever seen in a child. He would either come to class like a bat out of hell, like a Tasmanian devil, or he would kind of saunter in with barely enough energy to keep his head off his desk for most days. There was just never really an in between with him. When he was feeling rambunctious as well, it was almost like nothing could snap him back into reality. It was just very unusual even for, hyperactive kids and in comparison to kids at his age because this is kindergarten. As our relationship grew through our increased time spent together, Julian began to share pieces of information about his home life with me. And some of the things that he said were just things that I never thought that I would hear come out of the mouth of a child. And as our bond grew with this new information and the trust and the relationship, his attachment to me specifically grew as well. He began to cause disruptions at recess and at lunch in hopes of getting to stay inside the classroom during those break times. And when we were in class, he liked to be physically near me. He liked to sit next to me or walk around the classroom when I was walking around. He liked the attachment, the closeness. In fact, I always joke that I'm surprised that there was 1, 2, 3, 4 kids between him and I in this photo, because that really, really often happened when he was at school. It was at this time where I noticed that it was affecting his ability to interact with his classmates and make normal relationships. And we entered the second half of the year, and I started thinking about preparing him for moving to the next grade and out of my classroom, that I really wanted to look at Julian's life, look at his behavior in class that would have been very difficult for some of the other instructors, and really think about the culmination of things that had contributed to this period of emotional instability for him. And I started to ask myself, how can I, as his teacher and as someone who cares for him, really guide him through such a scary chapter of his life? That's where I began to research adolescent trauma, and it really just coincided perfectly with this presentation. So, this is something that speaks deeply to my heart. So, moving on. In the educational sector, as I just described, teachers serve so many different roles. We present materials, we provide instruction, but we also are a confidant, a role model, and even in some cases, a makeshift social worker. In this field where educators wear more the hats than one, understanding their students' emotional state is really pivotal to the success of the classroom as a whole. Trauma is an emotional state that our nation has just really begun to normalize in its everyday vernacular. And as the US works to be more trauma informed, which is a term we've coined now to demonstrate an understanding and responsiveness to those struggling with trauma, we are learning each day that trauma affects, our military, our police force, but even more recently, we're starting to really learn that trauma affects our youth. This is really a monumental connection for our educational systems everywhere, as it really kind of serves as the why factor behind some of our more troubled students in the classroom. So, we're going to look at the physical traits of childhood trauma, identify the characteristics, and demonstrating behaviors behind trauma surviving children. And then we're going to end with an analysis of previously developed trauma informed instructional strategies for the classroom. One of the bigger factors to consider when looking at childhood trauma is that children are by far the most common victims of psychological violence. So there's a lot of speculation as to why that really is, but I would say a general consensus is it's because it's believed that children's brains are still developing, meaning they are oftentimes manipulated or somewhat pulled into psychological warfare techniques that other adults may not have succumbed to so easily. And it's also important to note that psychological violence is more common with children because this is the type of violence that triggers these trauma responses that we then see in the classroom. And while the violence itself may be mental or verbally inflicted, what we see is the responses because they more often than not have physical characteristics. Psychological violence can be separated into 3 causal theories. So first you could start with like social or political theories, such as like patriarchal tendencies in a family. You can look at individualistic theories, such as interpersonal or psychologies on the side of the abuser, meaning things like maybe mental illness or substance abuse in terms of the abuser. And then lastly, family dynamic theories, such as interaction patterns within the families, maybe weak communication techniques or tendencies for verbal arguments to become physical. Trauma in itself, however, is classified into 2 conditions, either a physical event or a series of events, or a pattern of interaction between the abuser and the child. So, Child maltreatment, which could be physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional harm, family violence, neglect, any of those, may fall into either types of these trauma categories, meaning either as an event in which this took place or a part of a series of interactions and relationship that maltreatment was at the core of. It's also important to note that neglect may be demonstrated in different ways. Physically, such as failure to provide needs; emotionally, such as inadequate attention to the child's needs; educationally, such as failure to enroll a child in school; and medically, such as not providing appropriate or necessary medical attention. So now that we kind of have that background information on trauma, the definitions, the classifications, we can move into how childhood trauma really affects the brain. So, for every action, there is a reaction. And these reactions can sometimes be physical or experienced on a chemical level inside the body. While trauma may be inflicted verbally, emotionally, or physically on a child, the effect itself is experienced neurologically on the child's brain structure. Childhood trauma has a significant impact on the emotional, behavioral, cognitive, social, and physical function of children. So basically, everywhere. This means that while the reactions we see from trauma may manifest themselves in a variety of different formats, there's still going to be a physical response on the brain stimulus. There's still going to be a mental exchange on the brain. On a neurological level, brain development continues after birth and into a person's early 20s. However, in adolescence, the brain becomes dependent on environmental cues to establish neural pathways, what we see as physical responses to an environment. Therefore, in early adolescence, the brain is really making what are arguably the most important connections based on what a child sees, either positive or negative. The brain in adolescence works in what's called a use dependent nature, meaning the more exposure a child has to something, the more concrete it becomes in their brain. This also works in terms of sensitization. The more a child experiences something traumatic, the more the brain itself is affected. For example, a student who may witness domestic violence on a regular basis may be more frightened by the sound, by like a loud sound, than a child who had never been exposed. Additionally, the human brain is considered to have plasticity, meaning it is capable of changing in response to patterned and repetitive action. As the student becomes familiar with the pathway of existence, it becomes like a second nature reflex for similar instances. Continuing with the example of a child who's witnessed domestic violence in the home, they are more likely to respond to times of stress with violent outbursts. These frameworks, though developed in adolescence, will carry into young adulthood and beyond. And the farther you get into adulthood, the harder habits are to break than they were to develop. This is because certain reflexes in the brain lack the same level of plasticity, meaning once a region of the brain fully develops, it becomes less responsive to a change in the environment. So you take a child who, let's say, won't stop leaning back in their chair. And the teacher has told them repeatedly, if you lean back in your chair, I'm going to take 5 minutes off of your recess. And though the child knows that the response is coming, the punishment is coming, it has become so hardwired in their brain in such a deep habit that they just continue. They lack the same ability on a chemical level to recreate a different pathway with that same repetition. All of these factors lay the groundwork for the more overarching issue with trauma in the brain. Maltreated children have smaller head size and brain volume. This is via the limbic system, which regulates our needs, our urges, and our emotions. Trauma and maltreatment seem to have a direct negative correlation to this system. Additionally, each portion of the brain in its entirety shows a negative response to experiencing trauma that worsens each time. While each portion of the brain has its own function, these physical characteristics in terms of the decreased size and the decreased volume lead to all sorts of different phenotype expressions. This can contribute to lower intelligence, lower cognitive ability, less impulse and emotional control, motor development delays, poor social, emotional, or psychological function, and can even be a precursor to a diagnosis of mental or psychological disorders. However, most alarmingly in terms of education is the fact that loss of ability to modulate the intensity of feelings and impulses is by far the most far reaching effect of trauma and neglect. Meaning, we're seeing all of these different negative effects on the brain and its function, but the one across the board that most students really struggle with is this inability to regulate emotions. Without a consistent set of positive role models to learn from, children are really left to fend for themselves and use what they have seen and know to survive in what they perceive to be a very cruel, harsh world. Additionally, this continues to reinforce that lack of emotional regulation. So now we know what happens to the brain, right? We know it's not a good place to be. We know that these kids are struggling. So what exactly can you look for to note that these things might be happening? One component of childhood trauma that differs from other or more traditional forms of trauma, such as those identified in military personnel, is that the trauma actually takes place inside the home. A traumatic family life is a source for the majority of negative events for adolescent trauma inflicted students. This can be particularly detrimental to children, as at such a young age, their home is their primary place of existence, with school usually being the second. So, what exactly do you do when you're forced to exist in an environment that is destructive to your emotional well being? Where do you go when the monsters exist in what is supposed to be your safe space? Rather than feeling supported in their development, students actually regress in their needs when they enter their home environment, which leads to lashing out in other places, particularly a place like school. At school, they spend an arguably similar amount of time while also feeling the disconnect of the environment of school, the environment of the classroom, and the higher expectations and standards that they are held to at school. These sorts of contrasting views to their home environment may feel like a mockery to students who lack warmth in their home lives. So, if an educator notices a child treating their classroom with disdain, this really is a potential identifier that a student may be dealing with a traumatic home environment. Their lack of trust may signify that other adults in their life, particularly in their home, have given them reason to be distrusting, or that the unfamiliarity of the warmth of the classroom environment creates apprehension within the student as well. When speaking to their kids about their home environment, such as I did with Julian, some of their answers may also be telltale signs of a trauma thriving environment in the home. For example, Mita Cranhan of the University of Primorska attempts to explain the precursor identifier to these dynamics of the familial structure referred to as the living apart together phase. The LAT phase, she says, is characterized by a full or semi economic dependency on the parents, while at the same time being socially or emotionally independent. This is a abnormal concept at its core because family is usually perceived as a cohesive interactive unit. And for those of us who are more familiar with traditional roles and expectations of a family, this may seem really strange. But more and more, especially in lower socioeconomic status areas, we see this family style as the new norm, particularly in areas such as like where I work in Stockton. There is a higher rate of single parents or homes in which both parents are working, leaving a strong financial relationship for parents with their children, but they also are lacking in the quality time, which diminishes the more nurturing roles of a parent that we remember. This neglect on its own could be traumatizing for a child. Feeling abandoned, their socio emotional needs are going unfulfilled. If you, as an educator, especially in elementary, are talking to students about their home life and are hearing more of a alone or abandoned narrative in their answer, this is one identifier that your student may be suffering from neglect induced trauma. For example, I had another student last year when we were talking about our favorite foods, and his answers were things like boxed cereal, toaster waffles, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, etc., etc., etc. And so I thought this was kind of an interesting answer because most kids, when you ask them at 5 years old what their favorite food is, they're going to tell you chicken nuggets or pizza or mac and cheese. So I said, "So what makes those your favorite?" And he explained to me that those were what he just ate most often because he prepares his own meals. He prepares his own meals because when he gets home from school, even at 5 years old, he's the only one at home before he goes back the next day. It's searching for answers like that that will give you the like a hint that something like a little alarm trigger to kind of keep an eye out for what else is going on. These are really great identifiers to kind of pay more attention because you're hearing it straight from the horse's mouth. It's not, you know, a dramatization or something to lie about. These kids are just talking to you because they feel safe with you. However, because these students are existing on their own, used to existing on their own, however strange that may seem to us, they are typically apprehensive of adults. They do not believe that adults are going to consistently stay in their life or help them because they really have no example of that in their home life, which is where they kind of take everything in and receive their perceptions of the world. So therefore, it's an unfamiliar idea that an adult will stay consistent and be consistently involved in their lives long term. Another symptom of trauma in the home that a teacher may easily identify is a desensitization to violence from the student. As touched on before, the more the brain is exposed to something, the more run of the mill it becomes to their environment. For a child who faces violence in the family, this violent behavior is an ordinary and everyday occurrence or something normal. This may stand out as are abnormal more so in like primary elementary, but students who are exposed to violence around them won't be really as shocked to see it somewhere else, or maybe not to the same degree as a student who has never witnessed violence would be. So pay attention to your students when other acts of violence are witnessed on campus or even talked about in your classroom. Who seems just a little too familiar with violence, or maybe, just knows a little bit too much about maybe adult movies, or even just too many slang words that really describe violence. If something seems disproportionately mature to the child's age, that can be a really telltale sign that they were forced to grow by this inappropriate exposure, and that exposure in itself was what was traumatic for the child. So now that we know what to spot, the idea is, what do we do once we have the information, right? So, a trauma informed practice or a trauma informed instructional strategy is a way of interacting with the students once the trauma has been identified, once the exposure to trauma has been identified, once the need has been kind of explained, then what do you do next with the students? So, a trauma informed practice operates on 8 themes: safety, trust, collaboration, choice, culture, staff, listening, and resiliency. This behavioral approach shifts the perspective from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And rather than blaming the victim for maybe their explosive reaction, we move into identifying what exactly is in the background information that may have ignited such a response. In terms of safety, the Chadwick Center for Children and Families in San Diego, California, recommends the creation of a safety plan. This plan is a preemptive measure that's developed with the trauma impacted student and a team of dedicated adults, also called the student support team. This group was created for the student's well being. So it will be personal to what the student is experiencing and what the student needs. However, in a school setting, this may include the teacher, school counselors, and if appropriate, potentially even administration and the parents. This plan is an informal written agreement similar to like an individualized education plan for special education, and it's created in conjunction with the team and the student to create avenues that will help the child feel safe, both emotionally and physically. This practice is really a great demonstration of faith and dedication to a child who may struggle to trust adults. It's something tangible that they can hold on to, but that they also know offers them protection and peace of mind. It also really, if you break it down, demonstrates collaboration, another theme of trauma informed practices, and really begins to address the idea of culture and staff, meaning like the group of adults that's going to be around you, the tone of the conversations that are going to be, held as these people prepare for your success. So it really encompasses multiple themes while also serving as a really great way to begin to open the dialogue and build rapport for the school team with the child. To a trauma survivor, validation is a pivotal piece of emotional progress. This can be attained by listening and acknowledgement from adults. At the Australian Childhood Foundation, um, listening and acknowledgement in trauma-informed practice is demonstrated by training for the educators on the different attachment styles. So the types of attachment, children have three different types essentially. They may be securely attached, meaning they feel safe to explore their own environment at low times of stress, but in times of problem, they readily seek their caregivers. They may be anxious avoidant attached, meaning children are reluctant to approach their caregivers in times of stress because of internal beliefs that they are either unlovable or unable to attract care. Or anxious ambivalently attached, meaning children avoid approaching caregivers in times of stress due to fear of punishment or fear of rejection. While this training may not be experienced by students personally, it really is a great way to provide training for educators to develop individualized teaching strategies to provide quality emotional care for all types of students, meaning those experiencing trauma and those not. Those securely attached, those anxious avoidant attached, those anxious ambivalent, they each get their own personalized way of interaction with their educator that's going to make them feel cared for, that's going to make them feel safe. While this information itself is great and absolutely necessary for, providing great care, there should be a more specific behavioral training protocol, either within the school districts or even the individual school sites, to create a stronger sense of cohesion with the approach on the educators. So rather than just giving these teachers this training and being like, okay, take what you know and make something good out of it, if the school sites or the district created a sense of protocol, a training on specific cohesive ways that students would be approached, it's going to create consistency both across the classrooms and across the grade levels. And that benefits students that are experiencing trauma and that aren't, honestly. Children thrive on routine, they thrive on consistency. And so having that consistency allows children to know what to expect, and it makes them feel cared for and thought of. It adds to that acknowledgement. So while this is a great start, there is more that could be built with a little bit of time and effort. And honestly, training on attachment systems should be part of an undergraduate degree requirement for education. At this point, we should be able to look at this information and say, wow, anyone working with children really needs access to this, really needs training in this, really needs to know this really well before they get out there and get started. Trust is a huge barrier for adolescents grappling with trauma. Because most adolescent trauma takes place in the home, children are left with very minimal exposure to healthy relationship dynamics and have just a general distrust for adults that they've been led astray by. Creating an atmosphere of trust can be developed through transparency of service delivery. This can involve an elaboration on tasks, upholding consistent and predictable expectations, and establishing and modeling clear and healthy boundaries for students. I have always said this about all relationships, both in education and in your personal life. In dynamics where trust is lacking, transparency may be replaced where trust would have otherwise existed. Meaning, if you're lacking trust, if you provide transparency where you would have provided trust, you will build that trust back. Because over time, transparency will be less sought after as trust is earned and built upon. The Australian Childhood Foundation focuses its effort to build trust in the school community with consistency and predictability with school schedules, including recess duty and the figureheads that are present for those times. Excuse me. On the surface level, this makes sense, but it also kind of seems like a mediocre approach to something that's such a huge cornerstone of building a trauma-informed environment for a trauma survivor. It would be very easy to say that more could be done to create trust in this educational setting, even something as small as weekly check ins for students with educators to discuss the game plans and the goals for the following week, or restorative circles within the classroom to promote trust and camaraderie between the students as well. Access to choice is something that we also refer to as personal agency, and it means that students are given back the power frequently taken away from them in moments of trauma. Choice is also considered an element of control, and this is a really great gateway for adolescents struggling with control and emotional regulation, both of which are common symptoms in the aftermath of experiencing trauma. Basically, trust is one of the first things that students have taken from them, and giving it back in small increments and teaching them how to use it the correct way is actually more beneficial than them grappling and over controlling because they don't have that same level of regulation from regular exposure. The Australian Childhood Foundation demonstrates the power of choice in two different ways. On one hand, they allow students the opportunity to move about the classroom to designated relaxation spaces, also called quiet corners, when they feel an emotional outburst coming on, and also by providing children with a selection of activities throughout the pace of the school day to complete. As students ease back into the idea of making controlling decisions for themselves, these activities really serve as a great framework for practice on making tougher decisions later on in life. This teaches the power of discipline and choice. And additionally, by incorporating this control in terms of the academic realm, you're going to see a boost in motivation, which will in turn show a boost in engagement as they are rewarded with the opportunity to have a voice in the structure of their day. Something that they have opportunities that they've had taken away in the past, meaning giving them the power in something as important as academics, something that is usually very structured for them, is going to mean more because they didn't have it in the past in other ways. Now, if there's anything to celebrate in surviving adolescent trauma, resiliency would really be your answer. What usually begins as just a coping mechanism can easily be transformed into a survivor's greatest strength. Celebrating resiliency in action is a cornerstone of a trauma-informed practice, and places like the Potrero Hill Community Building in San Francisco really celebrate resiliency by allowing students who have experienced past trauma to create community activities inspired by the obstacles they've overcome. I find that to be a very powerful and fantastic approach to celebrating resilience while also providing so many other themes of trauma informed practice. You're providing listening and acknowledgement by giving these children the power to create these programs. You're giving personal agency. You're giving them the choice and the control to create something and make something beautiful. You're giving them collaboration. They're working with other people. You're giving them safety because you're standing behind them and really, vouching for whatever it is that they choose to do. You're working with the staff, you're working with the culture. You're really taking all of these ideas and blending it into a tangible activity that students can participate in while also really opening up a powerful dialogue for new conversations. People may, attend the activity, may attend the workshop, and may come out ready to discuss something that they may not have been before. And giving that power to somebody who has overcome something really gives them something productive to work with, gives them that confidence, makes them feel good about the things that they've survived, makes them proud of their resiliency, which is something that they should be. The power is placed back in the hands of the survivor to create something beautiful out of their struggle. And I find that to be very beautiful in its nature. So, upon suspecting or even confirming that a student has experienced trauma in their home, an educator may be left wondering how exactly to best move forward with the student. This is where trauma informed instructions or practices hypothetically would come in, similar to what we talked about. However, we are finding very few teachers are trained on how to handle trauma. While the field of trauma informed care has been developing for over 30 years, it appears that educational systems are late to the party in terms of the professional development training for current educators, or even adding degree requirement coursework for prospective educators at universities. We also see that school aged children perceive threats on a more physical level, things like facial expressions, tones of voice, sudden loud noises, and character unresponsiveness. So, without this proper knowledge or training, it is insanely common for well meaning educators to unintentionally trigger a child with something that may be second nature to their classroom management style, such as a stern tone of voice. However, the potential of adverse consequences to this can be huge. Without understanding these children's early experiences and how these experiences impact their brains and overall development, educators may unknowingly trigger and escalate the children's behaviors. This narrative, while unfortunate, is far too common in educational systems today. Teachers are not properly trained on how to respond to these children that they perceive as problem children in their classroom, and rather than knowing which path is going to get them the desired result, their frustration and lack of training really causes them to do the absolute worst thing that they could do for a child in this situation, and just continues to create that cycle and the break in the rapport, and the disconnect between the educator and the student. And you can't blame the teacher, because the teacher needs particular training. And so it's at that time, that we look for those programs and we look for those opportunities to learn. There's absolutely room for trauma informed instruction to be built into curriculums. In primary education, this can be seen in team building activities and social emotional learning. In middle and high school, there is great proof that trauma informed instruction would be written into a social justice and history curriculum seamlessly. Particularly in light of recent events in our history, our long-standing history with police brutality and movements made by people of color protesting civil injustices, there is a strong case for trauma and social justice issues working together to create a curriculum. In fact, a study of almost 35,000 respondents, 34,653, a lifetime prevalence of PTSD was highest among Blacks, higher than each of the other races. This means that people of color are more likely to be those students that we see in our classroom that are facing trauma at home. And while it may not guarantee to necessarily be the case, the cause for concern is valid. By joining these two ideas, this social justice view of history and trauma informed dialogue in classroom atmosphere, you're giving a voice to the students that have had theirs taken at every corner. This all comes together to create a really beautiful call to action to advocate for our larger training programs and district or school site-wide policies for responsive practices. However, as an educator in the field currently, and in a demographic like I touched on before, there is minimal training or advocacy for this emotional plague that's hitting our classrooms. With even just an introductory course into childhood trauma and spotting symptoms for educators, the field would be significantly more saturated with teachers who would know what to look for in a struggling student. And if they are not properly trained on what to do next, they're more likely to be able to refer them to the correct alternative support. Teachers are underqualified to deal with the cases that come through their classroom, and their efforts are made with resistance within the classroom setting. At this point, we have the resources, we have the knowledge, and we have the ability to make change. And like our great president, Barack Obama, once said, now it's time to get to work. Thank you.